Aroldis Chapman is a man that, for those of you watching this channel, needs no introduction. Nicknamed the Cuban Missile, he's built up a reputation as one of the scariest pitchers in baseball. Maybe this is because he grew up learning boxing from his father. Maybe it's because he makes a regular habit of throwing balls at opposing hitters. Maybe it's because, over the past decade, he's become too big to fit into the sleeves of his jerseys. Maybe it's because you know that if you strike out, he's about to embarrass you in front of the world by celebrating with a double somersault. Or maybe it's because he shares the record with Jordan Hicks for the fastest pitch ever thrown at 105.1 miles per hour. Whatever the reason, we can agree he's built an intimidating reputation across his 11-year career and shows little sign of slowing down as he enters his 12th season at age 33. In this video, I'm going to dig a little deeper on Chapman to answer some of the most pressing questions about his rise and dominance in the MLB. What makes him unique and able to throw so hard? How have his mechanics and arsenal changed over time? How has Chapman, one of the hardest throwers of our generation, been able to largely avoid the injury bug during an age when arm injuries are at an all-time high? And finally, what can we take away from his insane body transformation and training regimen? Let's dive in. According to sources, Chapman didn't begin pitching until 2003 at the age of 15. Up until that point, he played first base until a coach noticed how hard he could throw and converted him to a pitcher. Amazingly, he was starting for the Cuban national team in the World Baseball Classic just 6 years later. And not just starting, he showed glimpses of dominance. Wrote one journalist, quote, "Here was a mysterious left-hander, oozing potential and slinging 102-mile-an-hour fastballs past Japan's best hitters." Despite a reputation of being, quote, surly and undisciplined, he made waves in the baseball world, even though some felt his talents were better suited to a bullpen role. The potential of being a superstar in the MLB was calling Chapman's name, and in July of 2009, he defected from Cuba, escaping away from a team hotel in the Netherlands during an international tournament. By early 2010, he had signed a 6-year, $30+ million deal with the Cincinnati Reds, and he was about to set the baseball world on fire. Later that year, he set the world record for the fastest pitch ever thrown in a game against the Padres on September 24, 2010. After climbing the ladder that night from 102 to 103 to 104, he let out a 105.1 mile per hour bullet on a 2-2 pitch to Tony Gwynn Jr.
That's the winner of the night.
By virtually any account, Chapman has had a dominant stretch as a closer over the last decade. His career ERA hovers at just 2.25. In 547.1 innings, he has let up just 306 hits while striking out 905 for an absurd 14.84 K per 9 rate over an 11-year stretch, a mark that currently ranks him first all-time among pitchers with 500+ innings. He's been named an All-Star 6 times, and for most of his career, Chapman has been in a league of his own. In 2015, 77 of the top 77 fastest pitches thrown in the MLB belonged to Chapman. But it isn't just his velocity that has led to his overpowering results. Part of what makes him especially tough to hit is his extension, which is how far in front of the rubber he releases the ball. Big league average is just over 6 feet, but Chapman's extension is approximately 7 feet, almost a full foot closer to the plate than MLB average. According to StatCast calculations, this increases his perceived velocity by approximately 1 mile per hour by decreasing the reaction time a hitter has to pick up the ball on its way to the plate. Another contributor is the spin he's able to impart on the baseball, nearly 2,500 RPM on average, good for 95th percentile in the MLB. Now, this doesn't mean that his fastball will experience significant rise or induced vertical break, but it does give his fastball more potential to create a rising effect. His fastball averages 18.05 inches of vertical break, giving it above average hop in addition to the exceptional velocity and extension. All of these factors help explain why batters have been largely hopeless against Chapman over the course of his career, with batters hitting just 176 against his four-seam, 128 against his slider, and under 100 against his two-seam fastball. When they do connect, they don't do much damage either, with opposing hitters slugging just .233 against him over his career. But how long will Chapman be able to sustain this dominance? And is he, as some have speculated, really on the last leg of his career? Let's take a closer look. For a power reliever, two of the biggest threats to longevity and performance are injury and velocity decline. Let's first examine his velocity trend. While some power pitchers are able to reinvent themselves as finesse pitchers on the back ends of their careers, the eventual decline in velocity can often mark the end of a pitcher's dominance. However, not only has Chapman largely avoided the injury bug at this point in his career, more on this in a moment, but his velocity has held remarkably stable over the past 11 years. Take this chart of Chapman's average pitch velocity year over year. While there's no denying he's lost a touch off his top fastball, his average fastball still sits over 98 miles per hour, just half a mile per hour below where it sat at 24 years old in 2012, his first All-Star season. Moreover, it's entirely possible Chapman simply isn't trying to throw all out on every pitch as often as he used to. This is best illustrated by examining his two-seam fastball, a pitch he added in 2017. Between 2017 and 2020, he's averaged over 100 miles per hour with the pitch, on par with where his four-seam sat during the prime of his career. What's interesting about his two-seam is that he throws it almost exclusively up in the zone in 0-2 and 1-2 counts, which is as good a time as any to air out one's third pitch if you ask me. So while he has perhaps lost a touch off his absolute peak velocity, he last touched 103 in 2018, it's had little to no real impact on his effective profile as a power closer. He's still got 101 in his back pocket anytime he wants it. When it comes to durability, Chapman has held up remarkably well for a power pitcher. In fact, he's only had a few notable stints on the DL. One for a freak accident in 2014 when he was hit in the head by a comebacker and had to undergo surgery to fix a skull fracture above his left eye, and twice for shoulder inflammation, once in 2011 and once in 2017. While this level of health isn't unheard of, it's unusual for one of the hardest throwers in history to have avoided major arm trouble in a league where roughly 1/3 of pitchers have had Tommy John alone. How has this been possible when we know that velocity tends to have a direct relationship to arm stress, and that it increases a pitcher's odds of landing on the disabled list? Wouldn't we think that the pitcher most likely to be frequently injured would be Aroldis Chapman? One potential explanation for Chapman's durability is his workload. Since 2010, he's appeared in 563 games, amassed 547 innings, and has thrown 2 innings or more just 15 times in regular season play. In other words, he's almost always used strictly as a closer. Since 2017, over his last 180 appearances, Chapman has pitched a full 2 innings just once. In fact, I could only find 2 instances in his career where he was rolled out for a 3rd inning. Once in 2016 with the Yankees, where he went 2.1 innings for a July 9th game against Cleveland, heading into the All-Star break. And the second, a 2.2 inning appearance in Game 5 of the 2016 World Series with the Cubs. When asked about his playoff usage by the Cubs, which included appearing in 13 of 17 games, he told the media that he felt he was overused at times, leaving him tired for certain outings. To me, this highlights the fact that he's aware of his workload and has a feel for what weekly, monthly, and yearly workloads will best allow him to perform while staying healthy and fresh over the long haul. Because of his strict usage as a closer, he's managed to keep his workload down, which has likely played a role in slowing his age-related decline. As one National League pitching coach said, "This one turned out well because he's loose and long. Had he been a starter, he would have gotten hurt. All he wants to do is throw hard, and he's in the perfect role." Another explanation for Chapman's durability are his pitching mechanics. While we know that arm torques are highly correlated with velocity, we also know that some pitchers are able to have long, relatively injury-free careers. A big reason for this disparity is how a pitcher actually transfers and sequences that energy through his body, via the kinetic chain, to impart that velocity on the ball. As Dr. Glenn Fleissig, research director at the American Sports Medicine Institute, notes, quote, "Velocity is a factor. All things being equal, throwing 95 miles per hour is more stressful than throwing 90. But throwing 95 miles per hour with good mechanics is less stressful than throwing 90 miles per hour with bad mechanics. Throwing 95 miles per hour with proper rest is less dangerous than throwing 90 miles per hour without rest." So despite the fact that he throws over 100 miles per hour, Chapman is extremely efficient with how he produces that velocity, relying more on his body, long levers, and excellent mobility, rather than active muscular effort from the arm itself to slingshot his arm into release. He also avoids the common mechanical faults that may unnecessarily increase torques on the elbow and shoulder, such as early trunk rotation, poor positioning of the throwing arm at foot strike, or a weak lead leg block. Don't worry, we'll cover his mechanics in more detail in a moment, but the point is that Chapman's durability isn't entirely a fluke. Efficient mechanics, reasonable workloads, and adequate recovery help explain, at least in part, how he's been able to largely stay on the field. Chapman has been dominant, and he's still going strong. But the $30 million question is, how does he do it? What has allowed him to throw a baseball harder than any human on earth not named Jordan Hicks? In this video, we're going to discuss two of the main reasons: Aroldis Chapman's genetics and his pitching mechanics. Let's start with genetics. Just as Michael Phelps was built for swimming and Usain Bolt was built for sprinting, Chapman is widely believed to have a near ideal body type for throwing with high velocity. Rather than tell you about Chapman's body type, to illustrate this point, let's imagine the traits you would select if you could build the perfect pitcher for peak velocity. Kind of like the Create a Player feature in MLB The Show. Let's start with height and levers. We'll go with a 6'4" to 6'6" frame with proportionally long arms and legs. Let's also give him elite level mobility without sacrificing power or strength. Athleticism, let's toggle that setting all the way up. Power output and proportion of fast versus slow twitch fibers, put that on max 2. Mechanics, let's give him a lower half as athletic as Tim Lincecum, circa 2008, and an arm that moves smoother and with more electricity than Randy Johnson. Take a step back from this thought experiment to look at the super pitcher that you've created, and you realize that he looks a lot like Aroldis Chapman. Chapman is 6'4" with very long arms and legs and a proportionally short torso. This not only contributes to his long stride, but helps him create better extension and velocity, provided he can sync those levers up with his great mechanics, which he does. He's as fast twitch as it gets, a factor that is highly influenced by genetics, although proper training certainly does play a role. It was once reported that Chapman may have been able to beat the 6', 160-pound Billy Hamilton in a 100-yard dash, with some proclaiming that he might be the best athlete in the majors. In addition to being fast twitch, which describes primarily how quickly he can contract his muscles, Chapman is also highly elastic. In this context, being elastic refers to his fascial system, the network of tendons and connective tissues that act as spring-like mechanisms to store and release energy. Pitchers don't just contract their muscles from point A to point B. The fascia, the tendons and connective tissues in the torso, pecs, lats, shoulder, and more, store and release kinetic energy to augment the well-timed, explosive contraction from the muscles themselves. In short, Chapman isn't just a ball of fast-twitch muscle fibers. He's a springy ball of fast-twitch muscle fibers. While he's scary strong now, he was apparently still a monster in the weight room with the Reds, even before he got massive. One 2016 article claimed that other Reds players wouldn't go in the weight room when Chapman was working out, because they didn't want to be embarrassed by his strength. I'm not sure I buy that story, but we can all agree that Chapman is and was a physical specimen. While this was before Chapman got really huge, a common finding you'll see is that the fastest switch athletes are proportionally much stronger than they look. On top of his strength, Chapman has what is called congenital laxity, otherwise known as joint hypermobility. There is sometimes a trade-off when it comes to being too loose. On the one hand, extreme mobility helps a pitcher effortlessly get into deep positions in their mechanics to create torque. But this level of mobility is generally paired with less ability to produce force out of these positions. In Chapman's case, he has the rare combination of extreme mobility as well as extreme fast twitch and elastic ability. This means he's able to apply force through his mechanics over a much longer range of motion than normal, without sacrificing the speed and power with which he can fire out of such deep positions. At Tread, we call this strength through length with our pitchers, and it is the combination of mobility plus explosiveness that you see in the majority of the hardest throwing pitchers. While mobility can be improved on, Chapman is likely the last player in the league who needs to spend time stretching, as his genetics already predispose him to such mobility. From a genetic standpoint, Chapman checks all the boxes. He is the creative player we designed as kids in video games. And while it may be discouraging to the 99.999% of you watching this video who won't ever throw 105, it would frankly be dishonest to downplay the effect that genetics have on one's top-end velocity potential. You can check out our video, Can Anyone Throw 90 Miles Per Hour, for more context. But the bottom line is that very few pitchers get as close to their top-end potential, regardless of genetics, as Chapman. He happens to be the rare case of a physical freak who has also squeezed almost everything possible from his mechanics and frame. To go back to the Michael Phelps and Usain Bolt comparison, both were born with outrageous potential, but they actualized it through training and technique mastery. Only once they put in the work did their genetics prove to be the difference maker that propelled them ahead of the competition. So what about Chapman's pitching mechanics? How do they contribute to his velocity? Let's take a look. Aroldis Chapman's pitching mechanics are nearly maxed out for efficiency. And while I could spend all day dissecting what he does so well, we're just going to hit on the components that I find the most interesting and impactful. To start, let's look at his first move. Low-level throwers suffer from a wide range of issues from the very instant they begin their deliveries. Among the most common is taking too long to initiate forward motion through their center of mass. This is a big reason why many coaches have begun to understand how detrimental balance point drills can be to velocity potential. Chapman begins moving forward immediately as he lifts his leg, a move that I began referring to as the drift over 7 years ago. While other hard throwers, like Jacob deGrom, have similar forward moves, Chapman's is particularly interesting for 2 reasons. First, he creates a significant coiling action with his pelvis. This winds the rear hip into internal rotation and helps him hold his lower half closed as he moves down the mound. This type of pronounced coil doesn't work for every pitcher, particularly those with below average mobility. But for Chapman, it's almost a requirement in order to load and pre-tension the deep rotator muscles in his rear hip. This loading action gives him enormous unloading potential later on in the throw. Another piece of his forward move worth pointing out is how he dips the chin and lead shoulder as he moves forward. There's some debate as to why a good chunk of hard throwers do this, myself included, but my best guess is that it helps encourage a true forward shifting of the center of mass. Personally, when I don't do this, I find myself leaning backwards into leg lift rather than keeping a compact, aggressive first move. Here are just a few other pitchers who dip the chin and lead shoulder during their first move. As Chapman descends out of peak leg lift, he's already preset some very powerful positions. His pelvis and torso are closed off. He's coiled over the rear hip, and his center of mass has been shifted away from the pitching rubber without losing control of his posture and back leg. From here, he drops into what is called the hinge, a term that refers to the glute and hip-driven lateral move down the mound. I sometimes refer to the hinge or linear move as a rotational hinge to help pitchers understand that, although it's a linear move, the pelvis must be rotationally loaded simultaneously in order to convert that move into pelvic rotation in the landing. You'll see that Chapman gets into a relatively deep hinge as he rides his center down the slope, but that, rather than opening his pelvis or torso early, he picks up the target by looking out of the corner of his right eye. This is an important consideration, and one reason why we check the neck mobility, specifically cervical rotation of our pitchers in their initial assessments. Were Chapman to tweak his neck and lose the ability to turn his head nearly 90 degrees to peek over his lead shoulder, he would be left with 2 options: take his eyes completely off the target, or open his torso early to pick up the target. Chapman then rides this linear move all the way down the mound until his rear hip runs out of room to abduct, as his pelvis gets further and further away from the rear foot. This point is where lower level throwers make one critical mistake. They push off. Remember the rotational hinge? As Chapman demonstrates beautifully, the purpose of the lower half is to convert linear into rotation. Just prior to landing, he unleashes that stored rotational energy through the rear hip and pelvis. This is an important point of clarification that I can't emphasize enough. He doesn't jump off the back leg, which would produce more ground force, but ironically lower velocities. But he instead rotates through his hips, which turns the back leg over into landing. And this is where the magic happens. Because Chapman unleashes this rotation from his pelvis while holding the torso closed, he's able to create enormous hip to shoulder separation, taking advantage of every ounce of his hip and torso mobility and pre-stretching the muscles, tendons, and connective tissues through his abdomen. As all of this was happening, he's also allowed the arm to spiral into an even deeper position behind his body, which pre-stretches the muscles and fascia on the front of his shoulder. It's a perfect storm of pre-tensioned body parts, a powerful rubber band that has been pulled to its absolute limit before a baseball hurtles through space in the batter's direction from 53 feet at 100 plus miles an hour. At the moment of impact, Chapman is not only in the perfect position to rotate, he's gotten there smoothly and efficiently. Everything up until landing is a dance move. Chapman has expended little to no energy up until this point, but everything through his anterior chain is preloaded to fire. 2 mechanisms kick in as Chapman begins to violently rotate. The first is that the elastic properties within the collagen matrix of the fascia begin to kick in. and the second is an active muscular contraction, as Chapman fires his core muscles against a firm lead leg block. Just as the pelvis rotating magnifies the stretch through the torso, as the torso rotates, it magnifies the stretch through the throwing arm. This sequential storing and releasing of elastic energy, augmented by an explosive pulse of active muscular contraction, is the key to understanding how the kinetic chain works in pitching. Chapman's body slingshots his throwing arm into ball release, aided by the strength and power of his pecs and lats, which allow him to close the gap from landing to ball release even quicker. Worth noting, the triceps play a much smaller role in accelerating the arm in hard throwers, as the arm unwinds into extension as it's pulled into ball release. Overactivity of the triceps is a sign that the pitcher is pushing into ball release, something I've covered at length in other videos. What about Chapman's stride length? Most of us remember the sports science that detailed his nearly 7-foot stride. We've already discussed how his extension contributes to increased perceived velocity, with one of the biggest contributors to extension being stride length. Stride length is largely dictated by two variables: leg length and how long a pitcher is able to stay into their backside, something influenced both by a pitcher's mobility and the timing of their lower half. One reason that stride length isn't always a great measure to look at for pitchers is that it can easily be cheated by reaching with the front leg or extending early off the rubber, both of which kill rotation. For this reason, stride length alone isn't the best indicator of high-level mechanics. Chapman doesn't cheat his stride length. He gets there by riding the back leg into a powerful rotational unload. Because of his proportionally long legs, this is the range that his stride naturally falls into, without extending early into landing. For some context as to how long his legs are, here he is next to 6'7" Aaron Judge. While Judge is 3 inches taller, you can see that when it comes to leg length, Chapman is built different. Chapman has significantly longer femurs and a shorter torso than Judge. What this means is that even though he's 6'4", he's working with the effective levers of someone several inches taller than him from a stride length and extension standpoint. Interestingly, this body type is what former manager Buck Showalter was referencing in his well-known comment about the high butt phenomenon. In a TV broadcast, he remarked that, quote, "You don't see a lot of good power hitters or good pitchers that generate arm speed that don't have a good high butt on them." From observation, I tend to agree with you, Buck, but then he went on to rave about Derek Lee's butt and made it weird for everyone. The take-home point here is that Chapman's stride length is a natural byproduct of his mobility, his levers, and how well he stays into his backside as he moves down the mound. It's the effect, not the cause, of his velocity, and there are plenty of elite 100-mile-an-hour throwers who capture efficient rotation without 7-foot strides. Despite the fact that Chapman has consistently thrown hard over the course of his career, he has made two small but noteworthy changes to his delivery that are worth mentioning. The first was an initial raising of his release point by 8 inches from 2010 to 2012. As you might expect, this led to a corresponding decrease in arm side run or horizontal movement on his four-seam, while giving him a slight bump in vertical movement or rise. What's interesting is that from 2012 on, his slot has steadily dropped from its peak at 6'8" in 2012 to around 6'3" in 2020. I think it's likely that a lower slot feels most natural and comfortable to Chapman, and this is a sweet spot where he's able to hold enough vertical movement to miss bats up in the zone without creeping as high as it was in 2012. You can see from this chart how the vertical movement on his four-seam has steadily declined in relation to his arm slot. Worth noting, Chapman was able to make these subtle changes to his arm slot from changes in posture and trunk tilt, versus cheating his elbow up or down. By keeping his elbow in line with his shoulders at ball release, he was able to play with these variations without losing rotational efficiency. So how do you know whether to chase a higher slot with more vertical break or a lower slot with more horizontal break? One solution is to do both. Chapman found the best of both worlds in 2017 when he added his two-seam, which closely approximates his low slot 2010 fastball metrics without dropping his slot. He now has a high vertical break fastball and a high horizontal break fastball he can turn to, depending on the situation. The second noteworthy mechanical change Chapman has made is the timing of his handbrake. In 2010, Chapman had a very early handbrake, followed by a slight lagging action prior to picking up momentum through his arm path. You can see that he now has a much more seamless arm action, breaking his hands later and with no pauses or lags through the arm spiral. While his 2010 timing led to his throwing arm getting up earlier at landing and driving into layback closer to 90 degrees of elbow flexion, I can't point to this change as a clear positive or negative in his mechanics. In Chapman's case, he's shown that both timing mechanisms can work, and in both cases he's well within the ideal ranges for healthy, hard throwing patterns. Let's switch gears to talk about Chapman's strength training routine, something I know you probably want me to talk about, given that Aroldis Chapman arms pops up when you type his name into Google. Chapman tends to post videos of himself doing primarily bodybuilder style training protocols in the off seasons, including heavy bench press, pull-ups, shrugs, and curls. He's undoubtedly packed on a ton of muscle mass since he entered the league, but is his training and increase in muscle mass the primary reason he throws so hard? Let's start by looking at Chapman's approximate max velocity and body weight by year, starting in 2009. It's unlikely these numbers are perfectly accurate, given that players' listed weights often vary considerably, but it still gives us a point of reference to work from. What immediately should jump out at you from this graph is that, although Chapman has completely transformed his body over the past decade, there doesn't seem to be much of a correlation for him between max velocity and body weight. The 2 years he hit 105 came at massively different listed body weights of 185 pounds in 2010 and 215 pounds in 2016. His slowest velocities came in 2009 and 2020 at his lightest and heaviest weights respectively. So what gives? Isn't strength training supposed to help increase velocity in skinny pitchers? The answer to this requires understanding the mechanism by which strength training helps throwers. Athletic movements can be classified along what's called the strength-speed continuum. As the load gets heavier, the speed of the movement is slower. Think about a 1 rep max bench press as an example of an exercise on the far strength end of this continuum. As the load begins to decrease, you have strength-speed and speed-strength movements. Imagine doing a speed bench press with 60% of your max, or clapping push-ups with your body weight as the load. As you get closer to the max speed end of the continuum, now you're talking about movements using even lower loads, such as medicine ball push passes. At the far end of the continuum would be throwing a 5-ounce baseball, and even further 2, 3, or 4-ounce underload training balls. What you'll notice here is that pitching is actually on the opposite end of the continuum from heavy strength training. The reason strength training helps, in general, is that maximizing power production involves both a blend of strength and speed, or in this case, force times velocity, which is the mathematical equation for power. At a certain point, heavy lifting is the easiest way to increase power output by addressing the force side of the equation, but there is ultimately a point of diminishing returns. This means that getting from a 135-pound bench press to a 225-pound bench press may result in a substantial increase in upper body power, some of which may be translated into throwing velocity. But there will, at some point, be a scenario where strength training no longer reaps the same rewards as before. How much more velocity would a pitcher gain by going from a 225-pound bench press to 315 pounds? What about 405 pounds? It becomes obvious that not only will strength gains be exponentially harder to achieve in the weight room, but the transferability of those gains to the specific high-velocity skill of pitching will slow and eventually cease altogether. Personally, I hate that this is the case and wish it were as simple as get huge, throw diesel, but it isn't, and Chapman is an excellent example of this. The relationship of strength to velocity gains is better described as a logarithmic rather than a linear one. There's an entire field of sports science that looks at training transfer, which tries to establish how to best transfer one's efforts from the weight room to the field. In general, once you've addressed the force end of the equation, you're left with the velocity side of the equation, which is a combination of how fast you can fire your muscles and also how well you store and release elastic energy, using the spring-like properties of the connective tissue, the tendons and fascia. What you find with pitching is that the point of diminishing returns on strength comes fairly early. In Chapman's case, he was already strong enough to throw 105 back in 2010 at a listed weight of 185 pounds. This is why it drives me nuts when people point to Chapman bench pressing 315 pounds and use it to say that everyone should be shooting for such elite strength in order to throw like him. Strength is important, but the thresholds for maximizing throwing velocity are not as high as some people think. Another reason people overlook as to how Chapman has been able to largely get away with using bodybuilder-style training protocols is that he has outrageous congenital joint laxity, as we've already discussed. These types of guys don't have to worry as much about over-stiffening their springs, while a more tightly wound athlete may very well find themselves limited in how their arm is able to retract and lay back without staying diligent with additional mobility work. Zach Britton pointed this out in one interview, saying, quote, "We always give him a hard time, but he's the only guy I know that can be that jacked and still maintain range of motion in his shoulder. He's just one of those guys. A freak of nature physical specimen. It's that rare breed, and obviously that's why he throws 105. A bigger, more commonly overlooked piece of the velocity development puzzle actually lies in teaching the muscles to fire quickly and teaching the body to store and release elastic energy, neither of which is particularly emphasized in slow, high-load strength movements. Because there is such a strong genetic component to this, and some athletes already are so elastic and explosive, there may not always be that much left to glean from the weight room. In other words, what we're seeing is that Chapman was already so explosive that training could only help so much. While Chapman's velocity didn't come from his impressive strength gains over the last decade, it's still possible his strength training has helped contribute on some level to his ability to stay healthy and sustain his performance deeper into his career. One benefit of his training is for certain. Despite being on the back end of his career, he's as intimidating a presence on the mound as ever. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. Myself and our team spent multiple weeks researching and putting this video together. So if you'd like to see more of this type of content, give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future uploads. Finally, if you're interested in having us take a look at your mechanics, training routine, and programming, reach out to us via the link in the description. Our team currently works with over 650 athletes, including over 100 professional pitchers, and as of the release of this video, we've had 27 athletes drafted since 2015. And if you just have a pitching related question, feel free to shoot those over as well to contact@treadathletics.com. We respond to every single one. Finally, we'll be giving away a free t-shirt to the top comment on this video, so let us know what you thought down below. Thanks again and see you guys in the next video.